Life is a fragile, flickering ember in a vast, indifferent night. I'd always thought about how easily it could be snuffed out, how quickly it could slip between the cracks. Death was never far from my mind. It wasn't something I feared, but something I felt an uneasy kinship with, as if the darkness had always been waiting, just outside my peripheral vision. Maybe it was because of the countless funerals, the whispered condolences, and the heavy, solemn silences that had clung to my childhood like a damp, suffocating fog. Or maybe it was the grim fascination that bloomed in my chest each time I read about some poor soul's end in the morning paper. You grow up hearing the cliches. Life is short. You never know when your time will come. But they don't prepare you for how trivial, how fragile it all really is. I found myself dwelling on these thoughts even more the day I saw my reflection staring back at me from a store window. The tired eyes, the sunken cheeks. I almost didn't recognize myself, like I was staring at a stranger caught in some private, wordless agony. It should have been a wake-up call, but it felt like a bad omen. That day, the air was thick with the scent of rain and gasoline. I drove my rusted old car along the stretch of highway that cut through town, thinking about the time I had wasted, the jobs I had lost, the friendships that had dried up. There was an ache inside me, deep and gnawing, a frustration with the shape of my life and the endless, gnawing emptiness that nipped at my heels. The rain started softly at first, just a gentle pattering on the windshield, but it grew into a torrential downpour, a curtain of water that turned the road into a river. I barely noticed when I passed the turn-off for home. My thoughts had drifted too far away. The music in the car was playing some melancholy tune, the lyrics washing over me without sinking in. Maybe it was that distraction, or maybe it was just fate, but I never saw the truck until it was too late. The headlights came out of nowhere, blinding and hot, cutting through the rain. I slammed the brakes, but they locked, tires shrieking against wet asphalt. The car spun, my body lurching forward as if trying to escape the inevitable. The impact was violent, a crunching, splintering explosion of metal and glass. My head snapped back, and my body folded around the steering wheel like a rag doll. In that moment, everything became a blur of red and black, a whirlpool of pain that seared through my ribs and snapped through my bones like brittle twigs. The air was filled with the coppery scent of blood, mingling with the acrid stench of burning rubber and engine oil. Glass shards bit into my skin, burying themselves in my face, my arms, tiny, gleaming teeth that tore through flesh and left me choking on my own breath. The pain was all-consuming, an unending tide that crashed over me, pulling me down into a deep, endless cold. My vision dimmed, narrowing to a dark tunnel as the world outside the shattered windshield blurred into nothingness. I felt my pulse slowing, a sluggish rhythm, like a drumbeat fading into the distance. For a moment I thought that was it, that I'd finally reached the end of whatever strange and unremarkable story my life had been. But then, in that fading twilight, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing just beyond the cracked glass, watching, a silhouette framed in the haze of rain, unmoving, like it had been waiting all along. My last thought before slipping under was absurdly clear. I knew that face. I'd seen it before, somewhere, maybe in a reflection, maybe in a dream, but that realization faded, swallowed by the cold darkness that took me in its arms. The world returned slowly, first as a dull, throbbing ache that pulsed through every inch of my body, then as a suffocating, metallic taste in my mouth. Consciousness crept in, unwelcome and hazy, dragging me back from the comforting, indifferent darkness I had drifted in. I opened my eyes, expecting to see the shattered remnants of my car, the highway strewn with glass and twisted metal, maybe even flashing lights or concerned faces, but there was nothing, just a strange, cold quiet. I was lying in a bed, a stiff, unfamiliar one, like those cheap motel beds with too thin sheets and a mattress that smelled faintly of antiseptic. The walls were bare, no windows, no light except for a dim glow that seemed to have no source. It was as if the room itself exhaled a faint, sickly luminescence, barely enough to see by. I tried to move my arm, to test if I was still whole, but even that slight shift brought a fresh wave of pain, sharp and biting, cutting into my bones. Then, out of the silence, I became aware of another presence. I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't felt any shift in the air, but I knew I was no longer alone. A figure stood by the foot of my bed, half shrouded in the murky darkness that swallowed the edges of the room. My heart pounded, a sickening thud against my ribs as my eyes adjusted, taking in the stranger. He was tall, his frame wrapped in something dark and flowing, almost like shadows had gathered and clung to him. His face was pale, ghostly, and stretched with a tightness that seemed unnatural, as if his skin had been pulled too tightly over the bone beneath. His eyes were deep-set, black as voids, drawing in all the faint light around them. There was no expression in them, no spark of life, just an endless, impenetrable darkness. I knew in some instinctive way that this was no doctor, no rescuer. He said nothing for a long, agonizing moment, simply watching me. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but unnaturally clear, each word cutting through the stillness with an almost surgical precision. "You were meant to cross over," he said, his tone devoid of warmth or malice. Just a statement, as simple and cold as if he were telling me the time. "But you hesitated." Hesitated? The word felt absurd, foreign. I hadn't hesitated. I had been hurled into that blackness, helpless against the pull of whatever lay on the other side. Yet there he stood, as though my very struggle to hold on had somehow defied the order of things. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, but my throat was parched, every word a jagged scrape against my vocal cords. For a moment he didn't answer, his head tilting slightly, as though studying some peculiar creature. "Names matter little here," he replied, almost a whisper, "but I am what you would call the end, the last sight, the final word. The angel of death." The thought clawed at the edges of my mind, bringing with it a visceral, primal fear that twisted in my gut. But there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite understand. A strange feeling, as if I'd seen him before, felt his gaze on me in some hidden moment of my life. Like he had been lingering in the corners of my existence, waiting for the right moment to reach out his cold, unfeeling hand. I don't want to die," I said, the words raw and trembling, a futile plea against the inevitable. He offered no comfort, no reassurance. Instead, he raised one pale, bony hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. My gaze followed his gesture to an object that hadn't been there before, a mirror. It loomed large and ominous, leaning against the wall as if it had been waiting for me. Its surface was tarnished and veiled with a haze, the kind of imperfection that spoke of centuries buried in darkness before being exhumed and placed here with deliberate intent. "In life, you lingered on the edges," he murmured, his voice distant yet impossibly close. "Staring too long into reflections, watching yourself as though you were an observer instead of a participant. You invited me in long before you realized it." A chill crept through my veins, an icy numbness that mingled with the dull haze of pain meds coursing through me. It was an unsettling sensation, as if frost had seeped into my blood, but even the chemical fog clouding my senses couldn't blunt the oppressive weight of his presence. It was true, I had always felt a strange detachment, an unsettling awareness of my own mortality that had gnawed at me, even in moments of happiness. I had flirted with the concept of death, letting it dance at the edges of my mind, fascinated by the void that seemed both foreign and familiar. But this was something else entirely, something that turned my stomach with a sick dread. "You have been given another chance," he continued, his gaze returning to me, unblinking, unwavering. "But there is a condition." A condition. The words came with a heavy weight like stones tied around my ankles. What do you mean?" His gaze flickered toward the mirror again. "Reflections are dangerous things. They hold pieces of us, echoes that can linger and grow, feeding on our fears, our doubts. You will return to your life, but there is a rule you must follow, an unbreakable rule." My mind raced, struggling to make sense of his words, to grasp the meaning hidden beneath his expressionless gaze. What rule?" I stuttered, my voice barely holding together under the weight of the moment. He stepped closer, his form blurring slightly as he moved, as if he were made of smoke and shadows. When he spoke, his voice dropped to a near whisper, the words crawling into my mind, embedding themselves with a painful clarity. "You must avoid reflections, mirrors, windows, any surface that shows your likeness. To look at yourself again is to invite me back, to open the door you've struggled so hard to close. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. Never look into a mirror. Avoid every glimpse of my own face. It was absurd, impossible, but his eyes held no room for argument, no leniency. "Break this rule," he said, his voice as cold as the grave, "and I will come for you again. This time, there will be no second chance." With that, he stepped back, his form dissipating like smoke in the dim light, leaving only the faint chill of his presence behind. I was alone again, the room empty, the mirror a silent, looming threat in the corner. A twisted gift, this second chance. It came with a warning as heavy as death itself. I knew, somehow, that breaking his rule would mean more than just losing my life. It would mean losing everything that made me human. Waking up in the hospital, surrounded by sterile white walls and the antiseptic smell of too many cleanings, felt like emerging from a nightmare, only to be trapped in another. Machines beeped around me, cords and tubes trailed across my body, like they were the last things tethering me to this world. I should have felt relief at being alive, at getting another chance, but the memory of that figure, of his pale, unblinking gaze, clung to me like a sickness I couldn't shake. Doctors came and went, offering sympathetic nods and speaking in clinical tones about broken ribs, fractured femurs, and bruised organs. They marveled at how lucky I was to survive, but the word lucky rang hollow. I'd come face to face with something far beyond the grasp of death. Even as they assured me I would recover, I knew deep down that some wounds could never truly heal. They let me go after a few days, as soon as I was stable enough to hobble around with a crutch. Friends and family came to see me off, their faces painted with worry and poorly disguised relief. I didn't have the heart to tell them how hollow I felt, how every touch, every word seemed muted and distant, like I was hearing them through a thick wall of glass. The ride home was uneventful, an irony that stung more than it should have. My brother drove, asking questions, trying to fill the silence with his own version of the story, how he'd found me, how close I'd come to crossing over. I only nodded, pretending to listen, though my thoughts were miles away, tangled up in that single, horrifying command from the figure in black. As we pulled into my driveway, I saw my own reflection in the side window of the car, just a fleeting glimpse of my face, pale and worn, eyes ringed with dark circles. Instinctively I turned away, heart thumping, the memory of his warning creeping back. I couldn't remember ever feeling so unsettled by something as mundane as my own reflection. But now it felt like I was looking into the face of a stranger, someone I didn't entirely trust. Once inside, I let my brother help me to the couch, accepted his hurried well wishes, and waited until he'd closed the door behind him. The silence that followed was thick, stretching through the empty house, pressing down on me with a weight that was almost unbearable. Every reflective surface, the polished glass of the framed pictures, the dark TV screen, the small hallway mirror near the front door suddenly felt like it held a dangerous secret, each one a trap waiting to be sprung. I shuffled to the bathroom to grab some painkillers, keeping my eyes firmly fixed on the floor, avoiding even the briefest look at the mirror above the sink. The pills tasted bitter, their acrid tang washing down with a sip of stale water. My throat felt tight, as if some unseen hand was squeezing it, reminding me of the warning I could never shake. Days blurred together as I settled back into my life, if settled could even describe the constant lurking dread that colored every waking moment. I avoided mirrors, as he'd commanded, keeping every surface in the house covered or carefully turned away. But avoiding reflections entirely was impossible. Glimpses of myself in car windows, store displays, even puddles on the sidewalk felt like tiny needles pricking at my skin, a reminder that his warning was still there, hanging over me like a blade. One night, a week after my release from the hospital, I caught a flash of something in my peripheral vision. I was passing by the hallway mirror on my way to the kitchen when a shadow moved behind the glass. My pulse quickened, my eyes darting toward the mirror before I could stop myself. It was just a flicker, a brief blur of darkness that shouldn't have been there, vanishing before I could fully register it. I backed away, heart pounding, reminding myself that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of an overactive imagination. But somewhere deep inside, I felt a chill settle, as if something was watching. That night, sleep eluded me. Every sound in the house amplified, every shadow feeling too close, too intrusive. I lay there in the dark, listening to the soft creaks and groans of the walls, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, each sound feeding the gnawing sense of dread that had lodged itself in my gut. The next day, I made a decision. I covered every mirror in the house, draping old sheets and towels over them like they were corpses lying in state. The bathroom, the hallway, even the small vanity in my bedroom, all of them hidden from sight, sealed away. It felt ridiculous, a futile effort against the irrational fear that gripped me, but I didn't care. I had to do something, anything to protect myself from whatever curse that figure had woven into my existence. Life became a strange, monotonous cycle after that. I avoided reflections, turned away from every chance glimpse of myself, even stopped looking at photos that might remind me of the face that was now forbidden. Friends and family drifted in and out, offering sympathy that felt empty, reminding me that I'd come back from the edge. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know that the edge had followed me home, that it lingered in every reflection, waiting for the slightest slip. And then, on an otherwise ordinary evening, it happened. I was reaching for a glass in the kitchen, lost in thought, when the TV screen, left off and dark in the corner of the room, caught my eye. I saw my own face reflected there, half-shadowed in the dim light, an accidental, forbidden moment that lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in that brief instant I saw it. It wasn't just my face staring back at me. There was something else, a dark silhouette behind my shoulder, half-formed, blurred and indistinct, but unmistakably there. I froze, breath catching in my throat, a surge of cold dread washing over me as I turned, half expecting to see him standing there in the room with me. Nothing. Only empty air, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and my own panicked breath echoing in the silence. I whipped back around, staring into the dark screen, but whatever I'd seen was gone. The shadow, the figure, vanished. Yet the feeling remained, a bone-deep certainty that I was not alone. The promise he'd made echoed in my mind, a sinister reminder. Breaking the rule meant inviting him back. I could feel it, the pull of his presence drawing closer, like something lurking just beyond the reach of my senses. In that moment, a realization washed over me, sick and heavy. It wasn't only my face that was dangerous now. My reflection had become something else entirely, a doorway between worlds, a fragile barrier keeping him at bay. And somehow I had cracked it. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. The figure in the mirror, the shadow that loomed just over my shoulder, didn't vanish. If anything, it became more persistent, more vivid. Every reflection, no matter how fleeting, held a sinister, unnatural clarity. A glint of movement in the corner of my eye, a shimmer of something just beyond the surface of the glass, taunted me relentlessly. The warnings he'd given weren't abstract anymore. They were living, breathing threats pressing against the edges of my sanity. I stopped leaving the house entirely. I didn't trust the world outside, where reflective surfaces were unavoidable. The polished sheen of a car window, the glint of a puddle on the sidewalk, the cold gleam of a doorknob. Any one of them could betray me. My home became a fortress, every mirror covered, every reflective surface dulled or destroyed. I sanded the finish off tables, smashed the bathroom mirror with a hammer, and taped black garbage bags over the windows. But even with these desperate measures, I couldn't escape. The reflections found me. I began to see him in the most mundane places. The stainless steel faucet in the sink, the darkened TV screen, even the glass of water I tried to drink from. He was there, always watching. His pale, hollow face seemed closer each time, his black eyes like open graves, swallowing every shred of light. He never moved, never spoke, but his presence was suffocating. The air felt heavy with his gaze, a weight I couldn't shake no matter how tightly I shut my eyes. Paranoia consumed me. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My body grew weak, hollowed out by fear and hunger. The house became a tomb, the silence punctuated only by my ragged breaths and the occasional creak of settling wood. I started to question my own mind, whether any of this was real. Was he truly there, or had my brain betrayed me, crafting horrors out of guilt and fear? But no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, the evidence kept piling up. The figure wasn't confined to reflections anymore. I began to see him in places where no reflection should exist, lurking in the shadowed corners of my vision, standing at the foot of my bed when I awoke, his form pale and skeletal in the half-light. He was creeping closer, invading every part of my reality. And then came the whispers. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs that could have been the wind or the creaking of the house, but they grew louder, more insistent. His voice was low and gravelly, dripping with malice and ancient certainty. "You cannot hide," he would say, his words coiling around my mind like smoke. "You cannot escape what you are." I tried covering my ears, stuffing them with cotton, even blasting music loud enough to rattle the walls, but nothing worked. His voice wasn't coming from outside, it was inside me, curling through my thoughts, poisoning every moment of silence. One night the pressure became too much. The whispers grew into a discord, a ceaseless barrage of voices that clawed at my sanity. My reflection had become my tormentor, my face a vessel for his malevolence. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was hatred. I hated my own eyes. Their very presence felt like a betrayal, as if they held the power to draw him closer, to let him in, even unseen. They burned in my mind, an unshakable weight pressing against my sanity. And that was when the answer came. Simple, brutal, final. I couldn't look if there was nothing left to see. The tools were still in the garage, gathering dust from my frantic renovations. My hands trembled as I grabbed the screwdriver, its cold metal biting into my skin. I told myself this was the only way, that I could end the nightmare if I just took control. The whispers cheered, growing louder, more frenzied, as if urging me on. In the bathroom, I stood with my head down, my gaze fixed firmly on the blood-stained tiles beneath my feet. I refused to lift my eyes, refused to risk even a glimpse of the glass shards still clinging stubbornly to the frame. I didn't need to see to know what awaited me there. His face, his shadow, unyielding in its presence. The air felt heavy, oppressive, the whispers crawling through my mind like worms. My breath came in shallow gasps as I gripped the screwdriver tighter, the metal cold and unyielding in my trembling hand. My knees buckled slightly as I knelt, the edge of the countertop digging into my side. The smell of blood, sweat and fear hung thick in the air, almost suffocating in its intensity. The voice spoke slowly, almost mockingly, its tone dripping with a sinister weight that pressed into my mind, filling every corner with its dark presence. "Take control. Take it away from me." But I didn't hesitate. Not this time. I pressed the tip of the screwdriver to the corner of my left eye and pushed. The first puncture was white-hot agony, a burst of unbearable pain that sent shockwaves through my skull. My scream ripped through the silence, raw and guttural, as blood poured freely down my cheek, warm and slick against my trembling hands. The pressure in my skull felt like it would split me open, my head throbbing in time with my racing heartbeat. But I wasn't done. The second plunge was harder. My body resisted, muscles twitching and convulsing as I forced the screwdriver deep into the socket. The sound was sickening, a wet squelch followed by a crunch as the tip scraped against bone. The pain was unimaginable, a searing, all-encompassing fire that left me gasping, choking on my own sobs. My vision exploded into a kaleidoscope of white and red before fading into absolute merciful blackness. Blood pooled beneath me, dripping from my chin, soaking into the fabric of my shirt. And then, silence. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the whispers stopped. I collapsed, the cold tile pressing against my face, my body shaking with violent, racking sobs. Darkness enveloped me, total and all-consuming, but there was a strange peace in it. No more reflections, no more shadows, no more him. My family and I have been going through a very strange experience over the last couple of months. It's hard to even put into words or explain what is going on. I guess I can just start off from where it all started to feel off. A few months back, my family had a big get-together. My parents both have 2 siblings. They all got married and had some kids. Well, all of them except Uncle Matt. He never got married or had kids. That means I have 10 cousins. My aunts and uncles all live within 2 hours of us, so we've all grown up together. That being said, we don't normally have all my aunts and uncles in a house at once. This was a rare occasion to have a family meal when they were all free. I will not be naming every single family member in this post because that seems like a lot of information, and honestly, you've already gotten more information about my family than you ever wanted. But I promise this context is important. Okay, enough with my babbling. Let's talk about what happened that weird night. My parents and I went over to my Aunt Margot and Uncle Ken's house for a barbecue in the backyard. The backyard felt loud and chaotic. I tried to stay out of the way and get the night over with. I was honestly just there for the free food. We were all sitting down at a big table outside. I was so focused on making sure none of the napkins went flying in the wind, I wasn't listening to the conversation. My Aunt Margot came over to the table with a plate of really burnt hot dogs. My mum immediately started to laugh at the sight of them. Is burning food genetic or something? How on earth do you guys always do that to food? The Jensens need to leave the cooking to the Millers, my mum said with a sarcastic giggle. Uncle Ken looked at her confused. What are you on about, Liz? Uncle Ken snapped back. I mean, Margot burnt the hot dogs and Matt always burns food when he cooks. Remember, we had to ban him for months from cooking because we had to order takeout like 3 times in a row. Everyone at the table laughed, recalling their memories. Sighs of recollection bounced back and forth from person to person when my dad spoke up in Aunt Margot's defense. Honey, what are you talking about? Matt is your brother. I really shouldn't have to remind you of that. My mum rolled her eyes in response to my dad. I spoke up because I was suddenly confused about which side of the family Uncle Matt was actually on. You would think I would naturally just know that, but all my aunts and uncles act like siblings and call each other their siblings. My grandparents often refer to their son, daughter-in-laws as just their kids, so it isn't something I always think about. Wait, I'm confused. Whose side is Uncle Matt on? What is the joke? I don't get it, I asked, but was only met with a laugh from all the parents at the table. I finally got an answer from my mum, following the silence of the joke that somehow went over my head. Don't be silly, baby. Matt is your dad's brother. As the words left her mouth, half the table looked confused. Liz, what are you talking about? He is on your side. He is a Miller, my Aunt Margot said as she scraped off the burnt edges of her hot dog. Okay, now I'm with Amanda. I don't get the joke, my mum said while looking at me with narrow, inquisitive eyes, and then at the rest of the group. Wait, everyone slow down, Aunt June said, speaking up for probably the first time in the night. This is dumb. Matt is not Liz and I's brother. He has to be on the Jensen side of the family. I sat at the table watching my family in silence. Their eyes darted back and forth. They stopped laughing and were all just scratching their heads. After a few minutes, my mom got out her phone. She found an old family photo from when she was a kid. In the photo were her, my grandparents, my Uncle Paul, and my Aunt June. Nothing out of the ordinary. After looking at the picture, Aunt Margot got out her phone and looked for an old childhood photo. Aha, found one, she stated as she showed off the photo on her phone. Yet again, the photo was normal. It had my grandparents, my dad, Aunt Margot, and Aunt Susan. The next hour consisted of both sides of the family going back and forth showing photos, none of them with Uncle Matt in them. I had a few of my cousins there, but they all lost interest once they ate. I, on the other hand, couldn't be pulled away. I was engrossed in learning where the heck Uncle Matt came from. They kept talking back and forth. They figured maybe he wasn't anyone's sibling. Maybe he was related by marriage or a second cousin twice removed that I just called Uncle Matt, because that was the easiest thing to call him. We all have a relative like that, right? I know an easy solution you might be thinking of is to just call him up. That's also what I said, but he was working and they didn't want to interrupt him. But guess what? I needed answers, so I decided to call him. However, when I looked at my phone, I couldn't find him in my contacts. I looked through it multiple times. I remembered texting him about something a few days back, so he should have been in my text history. Still nothing. After being weirded out by his contact being gone, I mentioned out loud that someone should call him, regardless of him being at work. No one agreed with me. But once I told them his contact was missing from my phone, they all got curious and looked to see if he was missing for them too. We were all in shock to find him missing from all our phones. The family started to dig through their camera rolls and any digital libraries they had to try and find any photo of him. Uncle Andrew thought he had a photo of the back of him, but we soon found that we all remembered him looking differently. Uncle Andrew showed a picture of the back of a bald man who looked pretty tall. Aunt June called him crazy and recalled him having long, curly red hair. It wasn't like we hadn't seen him in a year, or that he was some kind of distant memory. I saw the guy last week. He came over to my house to help me with some homework, and I can tell you he didn't have red hair or no hair at all. He was, well, shoot. I can't remember what he looked like now that I think about it. It was safe to say we were all creeped out. As the sun went down and it got chilly out, the group moved inside. Normally, this is when everyone would go home, but I saw Aunt Margot start a pot of coffee. It was going to be a long night. The air was tense and full of unease. None of the adults wanted to go home until they had answers. I could tell the adults wanted to talk more but didn't want to worry the younger cousins. My older cousin Maddie clearly didn't care about anything that was going on. She just wanted to sleep. We convinced her to take my 3 young cousins into the basement so they could all get some sleep. But not me. I was invested. Uncle Matt and I are close. We see each other all the time. How could I not have a shred of evidence that he even existed? As my cousins shuffled downstairs, all the adults huddled around a big whiteboard Aunt Margot slapped on the kitchen island. They started to write down everything they could remember. What he looked like, the last time they saw him, memories of him. None of it was coherent. It seemed he was a completely different person in all our memories, even if it was a memory where multiple people were around. One of the only things that we could all agree on was that the Jensens always thought he was on the Miller side of the family, and the Millers always thought he was on the Jensen side. My mum recalled a story of Matt and my dad going to a lake to fish, but the hook got stuck on Matt's hat and went flying. My dad told us he remembered my mum telling him the same exact story many times. Everyone had memories of stories where he was on the other side of the family. Soon everyone was on the phone with a new family member trying to tell them the situation and asking what they thought about everything. My aunts and uncles were talking to realities on the phone I didn't know I had. Relatives that probably only met Matt a couple times at best. All I heard was one dead end at a time. No one knew where he came from or where he went. So the big question was, who is Matt? Was he just some random guy who weaseled his way into the family, telling one side of the family one thing and the other side another? Or was it something so much worse? As the sun came up that Saturday morning, we were all still scratching our heads. The deeper we got into who Matt was, the more freaked out everyone got. I was honestly surprised they let me stay with them all night long. The more digging everyone did, the farther away we felt. The more rabbit holes we went down, the less real he seemed. We couldn't find any evidence that he ever existed. Some of us searched all over the internet for Matt Jensen, or Matt Miller, and a few of us searched for other last names in the family. Of course, it was kind of hard to know who we were looking for, given we didn't know what he really looked like. After hours of discussion, we compiled a list of attributes that never wavered about Uncle Matt. He was a man. He never had a mustache, he was tall, he was bad at math, and he loved Jim Carrey movies. That might seem like a random grouping of facts, but that's because it was. We couldn't even remember where his house was. Some of us completely forgot, and others remembered different houses. It didn't matter. We weren't going to start knocking on doors to find a man we were concerned never existed. We started to believe that as soon as we began to question who he was, he just simply started to fade away into nothingness, like it was some kind of self-destructive on his own consciousness. It was around 9 a.m. that morning when people started to fall asleep on couches. The night before started with everyone being determined and saying the night wouldn't end until we found Uncle Matt. But here we all were, exhausted and with little to no answers. It felt like accepting defeat by napping on the couch, but we couldn't do much else. At 11 a.m., we all woke up to the sound of my cousins playing in the next room over. We all sat up and rubbed our eyes. You could practically see the gears turning in everyone's heads as they woke up from their stupors. I could tell when they realized their memories actually happened, and it wasn't just a weird fever dream. My Aunt Margot stumbled to the kitchen while yawning and started to dig in the pantry for something substantial the kids could all eat. It was clear they had already raided the cookie stash. As the adults had a quiet conversation, we heard something come from my cousin Cass that made us freeze. "Yeah, remember last night when Uncle Matt gave us all those cookies? It was so much fun," my small cousin said with a hop and a skip. "Wait, Cass, get over here and say that again," my Uncle Andrew yelled in an attempt to sound intimidating, but came out with a voice crack. Cass walked over to us looking like a confused puppy who just got yelled at. "What did I do wrong, Uncle Andrew? I thought if Uncle Matt offered us cookies, I could have them." "Cass, you are not in trouble. This is very important. Are you telling me Uncle Matt was with you guys last night?" Uncle Andrew tried to say in a gentle tone to not scare Cass. "I mean, not the whole night, but he brought us all cookies and put a movie on for us. Then he said he wanted to go hang out with you guys upstairs," Cass told us with a quiet voice. Everyone started to frantically look around the room, looking for any evidence of him being there last night. We quickly asked the rest of the cousins if they saw Matt, and some kids did and some didn't. I noticed something when I started to count the objects in the room. There were 10 adults and me upstairs last night, so There should have been 11 people in total, but I saw 12 plates out with the leftover crumbs from our late-night pizza, 12 spots laid out for sleeping in the living room, and 12 mugs or cups of coffee. He was here last night. As I mentioned what I found, my dad said he remembered seeing him last night. He said Matt brought him some water. Uncle Paul said he saw him go to the bathroom, but couldn't remember him coming out. They mentioned how it felt like it never actually happened, but he managed to place the memory in them after the fact. How else would they see Uncle Matt right in front of them and not realize what was happening? I had a strange feeling that started to bubble up. I felt uneasy and restless. "Wait, something is off here," I said loudly to the room. "Everyone line up on the wall. I want to try something." For a second, they all looked at me confused. They normally wouldn't let me boss them around like that, but they were desperate and tired. All the adults lined up against the wall. As I walked by, then I counted out loud. Something strange happened. I counted 12 people, including me. None of the kids were lined up. I wasn't counting myself twice. There was an extra person. Uncle Matt wasn't just here last night. He was with us in the room at that moment. Other members of the family even tried to count. We did it over and over again, even adding one of the kids to the mix. But every single time there was one extra person, but we still couldn't see him. How was he hiding in plain sight? Everyone ended up leaving my Aunt Margot's house that afternoon. We were all still extremely creeped out about the whole thing, but what could we do about it? Not much. It's not like Uncle Matt ever did anything violent, mostly normal behavior except for a few memories of him that were kinda weird. One of us remembered seeing him in the kitchen, stacking and unstacking bowls for hours. Another person remembered him once packing for a vacation, but his suitcase only had trash bags in it. And I have a memory of us sitting in front of a fireplace with him reading the instruction manual to a blender for a bedtime story. At least those were the kind of memories we had in the beginning. As the weeks went on, we started to remember things that got more and more concerning. He showed up in our houses in the middle of the night, or buying us all hammers for Christmas. He once bought hundreds of dollars worth of knives and put them in my dad's car. Once we developed disturbing memories of him, we tried to tell the police, of course. They couldn't find any evidence of his existence, so they couldn't help us. It didn't help our case that we couldn't even give them a last name. How on earth are they supposed to find a guy based on his name being Matt and no physical features? So who is Uncle Matt? I can say with 100% certainty I have no clue. Is he a man? Is he an entity? Is he a figment of our imaginations? Or is he nothing at all? I don't know, and that's the worst part of all. He seems to always be around at family dinners. Most of the time I count the number of people I end up with an extra person. He feels like a virus, always implanting a memory of himself being around, but in the moment I never see him. It seems to be a family joke at this point, always leaving out an extra plate for him or something. In my opinion, no one is taking this situation seriously. I know he hasn't hurt anyone, but why should we wait for something to happen? I swear I can feel it when he shows up. The hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My family has given up on trying to figure out who or what Uncle Matt is, but I haven't. It feels like they have all just forgotten the disturbing memories of him. I swear the deeper I dig to find him, the worse the memories get, like he is rotting and festering in my memories, right before my eyes. I'm starting to think it's his attempt to stop me from looking for him. The fact that he is punishing me for looking for him makes my concern grow more and more. Why is he suddenly running now that I am onto him? Why is he so afraid of me finding him? And what will happen once I do find him? I will find you, Uncle Matt. I will find out what you are. The second worst mistake was arriving. The worst mistake was leaving. There's a certain arrogance to human exploration, driving the flag into the dirt first, as if that means a damn thing. Of course, I'm not entirely cynical. Charting the world is about more than greed and glory. It's about overcoming that ancient fear of the unknown, mapping every plot of land so there are no more hidden crevices to keep us up at night. Nonetheless, our endeavors are selfish. And we have, for many centuries, blindly considered ourselves superior. When discovering new land, we've never considered a haunting possibility, that something other than man may have already staked a claim. Temper your expectations, Dr. Crenshaw, our expedition leader, warned loudly as we scaled the cliff face of a 1,000-meter-tall mountain. I grunted whilst finding handholds and footholds in unreliable nooks. We were ascending no ordinary mountain. The rock-formed skyscraper jutted from the dirt like a square, or perhaps a squircle, poking out of a sorting cube's hole. It was a flat-topped mound, rising almost unnaturally out of the ground-level forest, a misshapen mountain sprouting bushy trees, like hairs from its level head. That old-growth rainforest, we hoped, would be untouched. We wanted to discover it before anyone else. It was an Inselberg, meaning island mountain. Such natural formations, which tower above flat land, are difficult to climb, on account of their near vertical sides. That was why we doubted any early humans would have managed to reach the top of the berg. We were ecstatic to be the first explorers to tread on that sky-high soil. An undiscovered piece of land is a rarity in the 21st century. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the mountain top. Crenshaw was the first to disappear over the sharp edge. He crawled onto the grass, unclipped his carabiner, and gasped loudly, prompting Howard Williams, Rachel Garcia, and me to speed up a little, as we were eager to experience that momentous event for ourselves. I was the second to cross the threshold and see the rainforest in reality, rather than a photograph. I pushed up from the grass with my palms, and my jaw fell as I stood, as I witnessed the splendor of the wooded ocean ahead. A canopy of leaves nearly entirely blocking out all sunlight, creating a sense of calm in the forest, a sense of peace that we were about to disturb. This was a team of biologists and researchers who had spent years following in the footsteps of others. We did not stop to think. We were all enchanted by the possibility of doing something original, the possibility of making history. "What do you think, Steph?" Howard asked, collecting our climbing equipment. "It's pretty," I said, brushing mud and debris off my clothes. He rolled his eyes. "I was hoping for something a little more, scientific. And I was hoping for more than 30 seconds to conduct my research, Howard," I teased. He chuckled and replied, "That's fair." "I'm eager to see this cave," Rachel said. Dr. Crenshaw pointed ahead. "Well, if we push ahead, we'll be in and out long before nightfall." "You seem confident," Howard said. "Do you need a moment to get your bearings?" "Not at all, Williams. I've been studying the aerial mappings religiously for the past month," Dr. Crenshaw said. "To the detriment of my health, I must admit." Yes, it was a little disconcerting to have a yawning man climbing directly above me, I pointed out. "But after watching you work for so many weeks, I don't doubt that you would be able to sleepwalk your way to this cave entrance." Our leader laughed, letting a glimpse of emotion loose. "I won't argue with that, Smithson. Come on, let's get moving." Crenshaw was such a tightly wound man. I was relieved to see him letting his muscles loosen, letting himself enjoy something. He rarely looked joyous. His hunger to climb this Inselberg in Mozambique was driven by necessity, not desire. It was an itch he simply had to scratch, no matter how apprehensive he felt. He wasn't a cold man. In fact, I'd always viewed him a little as a father figure, stoic and silent, but layered. I wanted to help our leader, wanted to ease some of his anxiety about the excursion. That was why I rushed through the tall mopan trees of the forest, which formed a sun-obstructing canopy overhead. Rushed to catch up to Crenshaw. The man was twice my age, but barely broke a sweat. His pace was hard to match, so I settled for tagging along just behind him. "This is a historical moment," I breathlessly said. Crenshaw grunted. If, I repeated between heavy pants. "If we haven't been beaten," he finished. I shook my head. "We haven't been beaten. I'm sure of it. We were the first to locate this forest with the aerial—" "I'm not talking about recorded history," Dr. Crenshaw interrupted. "At some point, long ago, man may well have walked here." "How?" I asked. "The sides are so steep, so difficult to climb even with modern gear." "Sometimes," the man began, slowing his stride, "things are difficult to see, Smithson." And then he stopped, causing me to almost bump into his back. "Careful, Steph," Rachel said, almost colliding with me. "What's the hold-up, slowpoke?" "We found it," Dr. Crenshaw whispered. The leader stepped aside, allowing the rest of the team to see what he had found. There was a hole in the dirt, the entrance to the cave, to a pocket within the mountain. "I'll unload the gear," Howard said, starting to unzip his rucksack. "No need," Crenshaw replied, pointing his torch into the chasm. "Look." The four of us crept towards the edge of the cave entrance below our feet, and we followed the bright beam. It illuminated a walkway protruding from cave's inner surface, a slope of rock hugging the wall and spiraling downwards. Not a single member of the team spoke for the next 30 seconds. Our gazes traced every surface revealed by the beam. I did not know for certain, but I presumed the sloping walkway continued right to the bottom, as the torch did not illuminate the cave's floor 100 feet below. Eventually, we all accepted the hole's inescapable purpose. "A stairwell," Rachel whispered. Crenshaw nodded. "Yes, Garcia, a stairwell." "So we're not the first," Howard sighed. "All of that effort to find a long-lost remnant of our ancestors," Dr. Crenshaw finished, taking a tentative step onto the stone slide. "That doesn't seem like a good idea," I said. "We have no idea how old it might be." "It's more than a primitive staircase," the leader announced, bouncing his boot soles on the sturdy slope. "It feels sturdy. Just imagine the advanced craftsmanship necessary to construct something like this, Smithson. Those ancient hands could have merely carved a tunnel into the cave's wall, but the attached stones joined them together to form an intricate ramp. Imagine what marvels might lie below." Howard and Rachel followed their leader into the entrance, but I frowned and firmly stood my ground. It doesn't feel right. What kind of prehistoric civilization would have been able to achieve this? None of my team members answered, and I realized as they kept walking that I would either have to follow or be left alone, left in a forest which did not fill me with as much wonder as I had expected. I chose to follow. I hurried to catch up to my colleagues, hardly noticing that they had stopped walking, had stopped to stare in awe at the wall. "Careful," I laughed, echoing Rachel's earlier caution as I nearly bumped into her. "There's no handrail up here." She pointed at the wall. "Look at this, Steph." I followed the light of Crenshaw's torch to several lines of markings on the cave wall. The four of us moved closer to the symbols, with incremental waddles, as there was little room on the 3 feet wide slope. But moving nearer did nothing to answer burning questions. The marks, falling somewhere between drawings and hieroglyphs, became less discernible the closer I looked. It was as if the shapes were shifting, endlessly restructuring. I told myself, of course, that it's just a trick of the light. I felt silly, as I'd explored countless cave systems across the planet, and I'd never been afraid of the dark before, never been afraid of the unexplained. But there was a secret in that place I knew we weren't meant to learn. Something in my mind, or perhaps my very body, rejected the cave, reacted violently, screeching at me to drag the four of us out of there. Some small part of me, however, wouldn't cooperate. "You're the expert," Howard said to Crenshaw. "What is this?" "It's beautiful," the leader answered in a faint whisper. There was a detached expression on his face, an absent, unwilling nature to the way in which he raised a shaky hand towards the wall. Crenshaw was always detached, of course, but never like this. He was always lost in thought, but there no longer seemed to be anything behind the man's teary eyes. "Get a hold of yourself," I berated myself. "This is once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your career. Do not fumble it." "We should record this," Rachel timidly suggested, as our leader brushed his fingertips against the etchings. "Dr. Crenshaw, I don't think we should do that. We wouldn't want to damage it." "Damage it?" Howard asked before laughing. "It's a stone etching that's lasted for millennia. It'll survive the human touch." He didn't feel it, but Rachel did. I did. "Dr. Crenshaw," I started. Then came a sharp cry of pain from our fearless leader's mouth, and the rest of us jolted in shock. We steadied ourselves quickly, thankfully, managing not to plummet over the side of the slope. And Crenshaw's hand retracted, whipped backwards with what sounded like the crack of bones, except the awful noise came from the wall itself. "Crenshaw," Howard cried, "are you okay?" "Yes," the man murmured. He lifted his index finger into the light of his torch, revealing a thin trickle of red spilling down the back of his hand. "How did you do that?" Howard asked. "Did you cut it on something?" I started to take off my rucksack. "I've got the first aid kit." Dr. Crenshaw shook his head and shone the torch beam onto the wall again. "That won't be necessary." Only I seemed to see it, as the man quickly drew his torch away, but my photographic memory always serves me well. There had, undoubtedly, been a difference in the drawing. One of the shapes had vanished. The squiggles or glyphs meant nothing to me, but I could see each of them clearly in my mind. There had been, amongst the rows of etchings, a trapezium bearing 2 small dots within. It was missing from the end of the final line, from the spot on the wall that I was certain Crenshaw had touched with his outstretched forefinger, but I have no idea why I didn't tell the others that. No idea why I let them continue to follow the slope down into the cave. No idea, most importantly, why I followed. Things were off-center in that place. We were off-center. My eyes scanned the walls erratically as we descended deeper and deeper. The lack of any further etchings only made me fear that they had been there, but vanished. Then my skin started to itch, and it was only adrenaline that stopped me from scratching. Half an hour later we reached it, the end of the stairwell, the floor of the cave, and once he'd stepped off the stone slope, Dr. Crenshaw turned to cast his light onto the team. Everybody was uncharacteristically quiet, and I didn't like it. I didn't like that. As we followed the sloping staircase, I'd noticed Howard and Rachel scratching at their skin too. Red, nail-carved streaks marked their napes. "I need to stop," Rachel mumbled, swaying on her feet. In response to her request, strangely, Dr. Crenshaw faced away from us. He swung his torch to face the large black tunnel ahead. The true cave. "By my estimations, this tunnel can only be, at most, 30 acres long," the leader grumbled. "At a brisk pace, we could reach the end in half an hour. We must soldier onwards, Garcia." I crossed the cave's floor over to Rachel, her shuddering form barely visible with Crenshaw's torch facing the other way. The man was just standing still, staring into the dark mouth of the cave, its real mouth, not the stairwell we'd followed. By the time I reached my colleague, she had turned pale. Even in the scarce light, that much was clear. Her rows of teeth were knocking against one another, and when I placed the back of my hand against her brow, her skin iced mine, left me with the hot sting of touching something below freezing. Of course, that seemed impossible, given the cave's stifling temperature. I was sweating. I didn't understand how Rachel could be cold. "Dr. Crenshaw," I barked as our leader eyeballed the black abyss ahead. "We need to get Rachel out of here now. She requires medical attention." "Aren't you a woman of medicine?" Crenshaw muttered quietly. I clenched my fists. "I'm a biologist, Dr. Crenshaw. You know that, but I don't know what's happening to her." Rachel was starting to squat and shrink into herself, so I guided her down to the ground. "Cold," she whimpered as I started to take off my rucksack. Inside, I found my spare coat and a jumper. Then I knelt down and proceeded to wrap my colleague in both. Howard, meanwhile, strolled towards Crenshaw with a huff and snatched the torch of his hand. The leader did not protest. He continued to stare directly ahead whilst Howard walked over to us. Then the man handed the torch to me. "Could have done with an extra light whilst we were walking down the death slope," I said. "I wanted both of my hands free," Howard said, before offering a weak smile. "Not my fault you always forget the most basic things." I sighed, then said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. This is just—" "I know," Howard interrupted, kneeling beside me to inspect our frozen colleague. "What's happening, Rachel? Talk to us." "My stomach," she whispered, clutching her abdomen with unsteady fingers. "It's burning." "Burning?" I asked, frowning. "You're cold to the touch." "I feel—" Rachel began, trailing off. Howard reached towards her stomach, then stopped. "We're going to need to take a look. Is that okay?" Rachel nodded, so our fellow researcher proceeded to peel back the bottom of her shirt, but his hand near immediately let it drop, and I tensed in disbelief. I had expected swollen skin, maybe a bruise, a cut, or something that would explain what was happening to Rachel, something within the realm of science. What I had not expected was to see Rachel's ribcage, to see a hole in her flesh. Howard and I finally let loose a joined screech as we saw the hole in our friend's stomach start to enlarge. Skin, around the opening's edge, was vanishing into thin air, as if it were being consumed by invisible teeth. The ribcage itself bore growing gaps from the invisible nightmare gnawing away at Rachel from the inside, and behind that disappearing skeleton, there were no innards, not even desecrated innards. In the emptiest of Rachel's skin outfit, there were crystals. Bulky, blue crystals stained with a smattering of reddish-brown. Howard threw up so instantaneously that he didn't manage to turn away, and a thick stream of vomit filled our friend's body. This revolting sight, of course, sparked a round of projectile expulsion from my own crying lips. Once Howard and I had finished, I moved the torch beam up her body so we wouldn't have to look at the awful widening opening any longer. Rachel's face, completely devoid of color, looked back at me. Her eyes were harrowing, full of pain, but not quite pleading for an end, as she seemed unaware of what was happening to her. Thankfully, she was too weak to look down. There came the sound of Crenshaw's footsteps disappearing into the black tunnel. He was exploring without any light at hand, seemingly tiring of waiting, and I looked up for a moment, stared into the blackness, eyes tracking the sound of his fading steps. Now, with no more adrenaline coursing through my veins, I am aware that I felt something. Something at the very far end of the tunnel. Something large, still and malevolent. Something watching. Something in spite of its great size, naked to the human eye. "What's wrong?" Rachel whined, her skin's shade transitioning from white to blue. "Nothing," I lied quietly.
"How the fuck are you still alive?"
Howard yelled, sending himself into a splutter of coughs. "Stop it, Howard," I begged, before turning back to her. "You're okay, Rachel. Everything's going to be okay." "There are so many of them," she whispered, eyes beginning to roll into the back of her head. I shivered. So many of what? My colleague smiled as a trickle of watery liquid squeezed out of her tightly closed mouth. Not blood, as she seemed to have nothing left inside. It wasn't really a smile. Of course, the muscles moved her lips into the right position, but it was muscle memory. She wasn't happy in that moment. She wasn't even Rachel anymore. Whatever grinned at us, it lifted a finger and tapped the blue, lifeless temple of my colleague. "They're up there," she giggled, tapping repeatedly. "Upstairs, chattering to each other. I hear them. Even now they're still so—" And then Rachel, or whatever remained of her, extinguished. I wailed in horror and sorrow, though the knot in my chest had admittedly loosened. To see Rachel's torment end was a blessing. "Famished," Dr. Crenshaw said, completing the lifeless woman's unfinished sentence. Without a moment's hesitation, I shot the torch upwards and looked away from Rachel's corpse. The expedition leader had not vanished into the blackness of the cave, or, if he had, he'd somehow silently returned to his original standing position at its mouth. His back, once more, was turned to us, and he eyeballed the empty tunnel ahead. Dr. Crenshaw was not the same as he had been, however, which drew more horrified yelps from Howard and me. The back of our leader's head was missing. His skin bore an open wound which seemed to be growing wider and wider as something unseen munched away. "They're up there," Rachel had said. Howard and I no longer wanted answers. We rose to our feet and crept backwards, reversing towards the slope. "We're going to get help," Howard feebly promised as we both started to turn, preparing to hastily ascend to safety. I kept my torch beam on the floor below, illuminating Dr. Crenshaw, who still refused to turn and face us. But as Howard and I followed the spiraling staircase upwards, the side of our leader's body came into view, the side of his face. Once we were near directly above the frozen, mutilated man, Howard clutched tightly to my shaking body, and I leaned over the edge of the slope, casting the torch downwards. "Please stay there," I weakly requested, eyeballing the statue beneath our feet. Terrifyingly, I did not feel fear for Dr. Crenshaw, but for my fleeing colleague and me, a feeling justified by the project leader's head snapping backwards. I nearly slipped over the edge, saved only by Howard's firm grip, as Crenshaw's face cranked upwards, only there was no face left at all. "They are too small to be seen," the man whispered without a mouth, without vocal cords. "We enter their home, and they enter ours." Dr. Crenshaw's eyes, glazed and aimless like those we'd seen on Rachel, sat above a stretching opening in his face. What had once been his face, his mouth and nose had been consumed by that unstoppable, unseen mass. Then, when the wound eventually swallowed his eyeballs, Howard and I watched each of those tearful spheres turn into red and white mist. Mist swallowed like everything else by thin air. Only holes remained, cutting a tunnel from the front to the back of Crenshaw's head. The beam of my torch bored straight through to the other side for a drawn-out second. Then the man's body crumpled into a lifeless, near-skinless mound, much like Rachel. The two corpses would, in little time at all, become nothing more than mounds of bloody clothes. Then came skittering from the cave's bowels, a cacophony of overlapping skittering noises, which sounded to me like an untold number of feet, tiny, moving, relatively to their mass, at an unfathomable speed. Howard and I saw nothing of the sort, of course. They are too small to be seen. But the cave floor, 10 feet under our watching point on the staircase, started to darken, as if some mass of enormity were approaching, battalions of things only visible once they had collected in immeasurable numbers. Scientific curiosity did not get the best of us. We did not wait to see the unknown things up close. Howard and I rushed up the spiral staircase, rushed at such speed that we nearly tripped over the sides, falling to our deaths. We ran until we were winded, then we kept running, even as the skittering started to sound along the walls, pursuing us towards the stairwell's exit. But they did not follow us out of the top, did not follow us into the rainforest. We made it. We had collapsed, lungs deflated and bodies crying in pain, but we made it. That was why it took me a few minutes to notice what was out of place. I was still processing all that had happened. Howard wasn't breathing. I crawled over to his body, barely able to speak, and sobbed when I found him in the mud. I don't know how he managed to run up the staircase. There was nothing left of him in the dirt but bones and a few remaining strips of skin on his skull. Tears soaking my skin, I unclipped Howard's rucksack from the back of his half-body, and the man haunted me one final time by twisting onto his back, twisting to face me. I didn't move him. He moved himself, moved of his own accord. The rest is little more than blurry blotches in my memory, a blur of physical and mental anguish. I'm amazed that I'm here to tell this tale at all. That, in my state, I succeeded in scaling down the Inselberg's vertical side, that I made it to the airport, flew back to Paris, and collapsed in my bed. Precisely 90 hours and 100 missed calls later, the adrenaline seems to have evacuated my system. It was only tonight that I found myself gripped by a fresh horror. I woke, in the middle of the night, to the return of that unfixable itch. It was barely a tickle in the cave. Now I'm burning alive, but I'm so cold. I keep scratching, and with every fresh scratch, clumps of skin come away. Wounds form and they grow on their own. I am being consumed from the inside out, eaten by things too small to see. I don't know how those things escaped, but they did. Don't know how I survived so long whilst the others perished so quickly, how I made it down the mountain onto a plane and back to France. Except I do know. I know because I hear the chattering voices in my head, the voices which served that thing back in the cave, the thing which watched me from the dark. They did not kill me quickly because they wanted me to make it back to the world of mankind, wanted me to transport them out of their cave. They needed a host, and now they are the explorers, discovering our world, our home, a place that, for whatever reason, they weren't able to reach until I entered their den and carried them free. We enter their home and they enter ours. If I'd known, I would have remained in that isolated sky forest to die, but it's too late. You see, I noticed it on the plane, but I thought I'd lost my mind. Thought I'd simply been affected by the trauma of what I experienced at the bottom of the stairwell, but I wasn't imagining things. The passengers started scratching their flesh. By the end of the flight, every last person on that flight was clawing irritably at their skin. It's out in the world now. You're not safe. Nobody's safe because they're too small to see. Too small and too quick. Forgive us for what we did. I am sorry.